So how do you know if somebody's illegally parked? Let's take a brief look at that in this short guide to illegal parking and the ADA. You probably encountered videos before watching people get enraged over illegal parking, parking in accessible spaces, so on and so forth. But have you ever really taken the time to understand what exactly is illegal parking? What are the requirements of accessible parking stalls? And what exactly does it mean to be illegally parked? Well, that's just a few of the questions that we're going to answer today. So how are you, in your own community, going to be able to spot illegal parking? Let's take a look at what actually defines illegal parking. And more so, let's start with the actual spaces themselves. So we can look at illegal parking as somebody who parks in an accessible space but does not necessarily meet the qualifications to park in that space. But how do you know if that person is actually qualified or not? They're going to have accessible signage. This is one example of that accessible signage. This is an accessible parking sign. Another way to define somebody who can park in an accessible space is somebody who has an accessible parking tag in the rear view mirror of their car. The ADA itself has very strict codes to follow. However, there are city ordinances to follow as well, which do take into account minor variations in ADA and other federal regulations. One thing that can define an accessible space is it's adjacent to an access aisle. An access aisle is a striped off area that allows for a clear path of travel and also serves as a loading and unloading zone. Accessible spaces themselves, as defined by the ADA, are an 8-foot wide space with a 5-foot access aisle. ADA accessible spaces, as defined by the ADA itself, require an 8-foot space with a 5-foot access aisle. Van accessible spaces, defined by the ADA, must meet a minimum of an 11-foot space adjacent to a 5-foot access aisle. Defining an accessible space can be difficult. For instance, in our area, we go by something called universal parking, which means that every space must be 11 foot adjacent to a 5-foot access aisle, or a combination thereof. This, on a more technical level, makes every space van accessible. There's also an issue with signage. Signage, as defined by the ADA, must meet certain minimal guidelines. 60 inches from the bottom of the sign to the clear floor space must be met in order to be an accessible space. In addition, the actual sign itself may vary in certain localities. One of these minimal requirements is that the sign be blue with a white background, as seen here. Oftentimes we get asked, is the actual accessible sign required to be painted on the space? Sometimes yes, it is required, sometimes no, it isn't. The ADA does not make a provision for the actual painted sign itself. However, certain city ordinances or state laws may make minimal requirements for the accessible symbol painted in the stall. Curb cuts are equally as important because it defines the point of travel between an access aisle and the actual sidewalk itself. As you can see, this is what's called a zero transition curb cut. It allows easy access from an access aisle to a path of travel. Another feature of accessible spaces is the slope. According to new ADA guidelines, a slope must fall within a ratio of 1 in 48, or 2.08%. This is for both running slope and cross slope. Now here's something we see quite often. What happens if you have an accessible aisle, an accessible space, but you're missing the accessible signage? Is that space still accessible? No, only spaces that have the designated signage themselves are accessible. So this is how you can spot accessible signage in your area, and how if you see somebody who you think is illegally parked, you should be able to identify if they are actually parked illegally. Check out some of our other ADA videos and make sure to subscribe.